Hi friends, continuing to the chapter The Miracle. Do you mean that the others, like Bernarda, had in time similar vision? Asked Amanda. Since Father Coyers was apparently incapable of laughing, he met the question with unfamiliar snorts. Other like Bernardis, countless other like Bernardis before she came along in the year since. I have heard that between the years 1928 and 1975, there were at least 83 persons in Italy alone who claim to have seen the Virgin Mary. You have heard about the incident at La Castle near Grenoble. I think I read about it is in passing, said Liz. I haven't, Amanda told the priest. La Salle was one of your typical rustic villages, began Father Cautious with Lirish. On September 19, 1846, two children of the village, shepherd children, Madeline Calvert, 15, and a boy of 11, Maximin Grindand, saw the Virgin Mary and heard a prohibit secrets from her. The boy was manhandled by the police but refused to reveal the secrets. Both of the youngsters were integrated for 15 consciousness hours but would not reveal the secrets. Instead, 4 years later, they sent the secret that the Blessed Virgin had given them to the Pope Pius IX, who did not reveal them. The authenticity of the vision seems by the pair was hotly debated. Madeline was abnormal in some ways, ignorant, and even Catholic apologists admitted that she was lazy and careless. Maximin was worse, a known liar but clever and vulgar. Both were characterized as repulsive young people. Nevertheless, the ultramontaneous, the conservative church over the state Catholics, bought their story completely. After forcing the children out of the sight, the child was placed in a convent in England. The boy with the Jewist, the good fathers promoted the La Castle miracle, put it over, and the pilgrimage began and the community prospered. Sounds familiar. Incredible, said Amanda. La Salle was found before Lourdes. The miracles and the Fatimas in Portugal came after. 3 shepherd children, Lucia dos Santos 10, Francisco 9, and his sister Jacinta Mato 7, on May 13, 1917, saw the Virgin Mary in a bush and once a month for the 6 months thereafter. As usual, they hear the secrets, and there was a spectacism among the clergy, and the children were even put on the trial. But the children and their vision prevailed, and the Fatima became a miracle shrine second only to the Lourdes. The Fatima youngsters must know about Bernardis, said Liz. As Bernardis probably knew about La Casale, very likely, agreed Father Coyers. In Bernardis' case, however, she must have drawn her scenario, if such it was, from Berthamin. Berthamin, said Amanda blankly. It is a town of an Cave de Pauv, not far from the Lourdes. It is a place where the miracles supposedly occurred for many centuries. The Virgin Mary in the white materialized there a number of times. The most dramatic uprising took place when a little girl fell into the river and was certain to drown. The Virgin Mary appeared on the bank, held out a sturdy branch for the shrinking girl to grasp, and she was pulled shore and saved. Berthamin has its own wonder worker in Michael Grotius, who became the Father Superior at the local seminary and was a splendid teacher. He also had the ability to levitate. He died in 1863 and was canonized as a saint in 1947. Anyway, it was from Bethman's the Bernardines may have fashioned her own Lourdes scenario. Amanda was interrogated how she wanted to know. Bernardi was attracted by Berthmans and used to visit the church there often. The Berthman church acknowledged that Bernardis was there praying for a number of days, 4 or 5 before she had seen her first apparition. The very rosary Bernardi used to at the grotto was the one she has purchased in Berthman. Michael Gerastos was still alive during and after the Bernardis apparition. She was sent to see him and he believed her story from the start. When someone told him, "Those Lourdes may overshadow your Berthmans," Groist was aged to have replied, "What does it matter? If Our Lady is honored, he visits the grotto many times before his death." Father Coyes paused. Well, the obvious point is that Bernardis could easily have picked up the Virgin Mary apparition idea at Berthmans and imported it to the Lourdes. Liz leaned forward. "We appreciate your forthrightness, Father. Many priests might not be realistic and candid. Clearly, you are a man of faith, yet no one who hold the Bernardis story suspect. I am afraid that this is my feeling," said Father Coyes. Bernardis' frequent visit to Berthman certainly gave a reason for holding Bernardis suspect, said Liz. "I wonder if you have any other evidence that might indict Bernardi." Father Coyes backed off slightly. "That might indicate her. No, I have no proven evidence against her or on her honesty. Just suspensions, just circumstantial evidence that make her story questionable." "Any of this you wish to speak about?" pressed Liz. "There is too much for too much," said Father Coyes. "For one thing, Bernardi's parent, Francois and Louis Saborius, are portrayed in those pretty color booklets they seize in the Lourdes as improvised, struggling but intellectualist parents, perhaps too generous and charitable nonsense. They were both terrible drunks. I do not mean to visit the sin of the parents on the children, but just to show you what an unstable background Bernarda had. Nor did she have a decent home or a decent mental meal in all the years before she saw the apparitions. Her father was not fit to make a living. Bernardi was familiarized most of the time. The food she ate was mostly cornmeal pottery, watered down vegetable soup, cornmeal. She often threw up her food. She might have suffered from aroustic poisoning as well, which can make people hallucinate, interrogated Amanda. "It can," said Father Coyes, "but even without such poisoning, her stomach was empty and her head was light. All the family starved. Bernardi's brother was seen cramping candle wax from the church floor for food. Bernardi's unlearned, constantly hungry, constantly ill with asthma, and without dependable love, was certainly a candidate for, as you suggested, Mr. Clayton, hallucinations." "Yet," said Liz, "Bernardi's was so exact in what she was and what she heard, and this made a favorable impression on most believers." Father Coyes nodded. "Well, let me examine how our heroine might have come to what she saw and heard. The Virgin Mary and Bernardi saw was very young, too young. Spectic thought for a mother of Christ. as one English sceptic, Edith Saunders, explained. Father Cautious reached for a folder on his desk and located a sheet of a paper inside. He began to read it. From it, Bernardi looked into the grotto and saw a hard reality. She was despised and rejected and had no way of making herself admirable. Life has cast her disarmed into its competitive arena. She was 14 years old, but so small and young looking that she appeared to be only 11. The ideal of a little girl is naturally a little girl, and the uprising had the form of a girl of an dazzling charm and beauty. She appeared to be about 10 years old, and in being even smaller than Bernardi, she conscientiously proved that one could be very small and yet be perfection itself. To Amanda's analytical mind, this was all insightful. Bernardes has been suffering from reactive psychosis, the obvious result of revealed environmental pressure. Bernardes had undergone a total flight from reality. In order to escape the problems of living, she had lost herself in imaginary satisfactions that made her existence more endurable. For the Coyers deserved praise. That information, that's very good, Amanda told him. There is more, much more, Father Coyes promised. The virgin that Bernarda saw was wearing a pure white dress. Well, that's more or less traditional, and Bernardi herself admitted that the Virgin was dressed much like the children of Mary. A group of young Catholic women, volunteers in the village, who were very beloved and were often attired in the pure white dresses. What about the Immaculate Conception bit? Liz interrupted. The Virgin information, Bernardes, that she was the Immaculate Conception, a conception that Bernardi could not know about it. Father Cautious uttered one of his characteristic snort. Bernardes knew about the Immaculate Conception, that I guaranteed you. She may not have understood the concept, but she knew about it. After all, when Bernardi was staying in the town of Bathurst a few months before her visitors, she attended or saw the feast of an Immaculate Conception celebrate there as a holy day. The feast of the Immaculate Conception was also a holy day in the Lourdes itself. Bernardi certainly observed this. Yes, Bernardes carried it off, presented it all as something new to her, Liz said. Possibly with some help, Father Coyes added mysteriously. He proceeded to clarify and expand on his remarks. There may have been a degree of stage management, meaning Liz Prudhoe. While Father Pelryman would not allow his fellow priest to attend Bernardes' exercises at the grotto, said Father Coyes. He did not permit Bernardes to have a constant exact with these clergymen in the confessional. These clergymen in the Lourdes and the Baptists were Marians, strongly pro-Mary and in the favor of an Immaculate Conception dogma. And one pointed to Bernardes saying, if the Blessed Virgin were to appear to anyone, that's the sort of a child she would choose. Furthermore, her Lourdes confessor constantly advised Bernardi, despite all restrictions, to continue to go to the grotto. In short, they were members of a church pushing for the acceptance of the visions, nor were happening as has been made out. Once when Bernardes came down to the grotto with a great crowd on hand, perhaps 4,000 people, Madame Jammet overheaded Francio, Bernardes' father, whispered to her, "Don't make any mistakes today. Do it well." "Wow," said Liz. "Is that really true?" It was noted firsthand, Father Cautious assured her. Amanda, whose mind was on her cane, went to something else. But the original cures, like the Troy girl, she said to the beast, "What about them?" "Many of the cures were not as created," said Father Curex. "You have cited a perfect example. Eugene Troy, 12 years old. She has been blind for 9 years. To Lutz, to the grotto from Luz, and was embarrassed by Berenda, and came away with her sight fully restored. Shortly after, her priest in the Luz revealed that Eugene had never been totally blind, has always been able to see and to work at her job. There had been no cure at all, and besides, the doctors in 1858 were very limited in their knowledge and unscientific. But they are scientifics today." Liz challenged him, and cure suspendedly occurred. Amanda turned to Liz. "There is a wish fulfillment, self hypnosis, and there are so many diseases that the physicians still don't know enough about, and many are eventually, especially under a certain stimuli, self curing." Pressingly agreed Father Chaos. "There can be the cures, but they needed to be regarded as miracles." With a grunt, he lifted his bulk out of the chair and stood over the two men. After the cures began and the Lutz had its foothold in the frame, there was a problem. The problem was that young Bernarda, who was growing up as a legend, what do you do with her? Continual exposure to the public long after the visions had ceased might lead her to a contradiction, and visionary behavior might erode her legend. The master of the Lutz encouraged her to remove herself from the public eyes, became an reality faceless nun. To this end, her master encouraged her to leave Lutz forever. She decided to go to the Nevers, enter the convent of St. Gildarts, became a closeted nun. Before Bernardis was removed to Nevers, an eligible young man and at artistic court and a medical student who had fallen in love with her came to Lutz to propose marriage. Bernardi was never told about that. The young man was rejected by her guardians. She was spirited out of sight to the convent. The women had come to their feet. Might there be many things of interesting for us in Nevers? Liz wondered. "I don't know," said Father Chaos. "It is true that Bernardis Novus Mistress is Nevers. Mother Voizo did not believe in Bernardis' vision. Mother Voiza also treated her a little and harshly, almost sadistically, because she concentrated Bernardis too self-important and vain. However, this may have been Mother Voiza's problem and not Bernardis. At any rate, that was in the older days. I have no idea how the sisters up there regards Bernardis today. Probably highly, since she was elevated to the sainthood after her death in 1879. He was fussing about his tabletop now, obviously eagerly to return to his duties. "You might go up there and see yourself." "We just might," said Liz. "Father, I don't know how I can thank you enough for Mrs. Calaton and myself, for the time you have given us and for the balanced picture you have given us of Bernardis." "My pleasure. I have tried my best to help," said Father Cautious grumpily. "Good luck to you both." After they had left their Pittsbury, excited from the front entrance into the waiting afternoon, they paused to light cigarettes and then looked at each other. Well, what do you think? Amanda wanted to know. What do you think? Encountered Liz. For me, fascinating stuff. A healthier view of the Lutz matter, said Amanda. Maybe I will repeat some of it to Ken only. Only what? Only I am not perfectly sure about our fat priest friend, said Amanda. It crossed my mind that much of his cynicism, backbiting might have been caused by pique and jealousy of the Lutz, and the way it was outstripped the courtiers as an attraction. No doubt about that, agreed Liz. Still, it doesn't make what have gave us any less true. But you haven't told me what you really think, said Amanda. The true or not, and I guess most of what Cautious told us has some basic. In fact, it is only a conversation piece, peripheral material, said Liz. None of it's added up to an API exposure story. I still need some piece of an hard central evidence that shows Bernardis up a Clarendon or an adolescent nut. Unless I have a piece of an provocable evidence, I can file a story. Maybe you're right, said Amanda. Liz started down the steps to the place Jean Moylan and its parked car, with Amanda falling in her beside her let's head back to Lutz before it is get dark. Liz said, once we are there, I will find out how to get to Nevers. I believe it is nearer to the Paris than Lutz. If we want to spend tomorrow there, we may have to leave tonight. You game. Why not? We can miss a bet, said Liz. Nevers may give us the key that I will open up to the grotto and show up Bernardis' big secret. This, if there is a secret, said Amanda. Are you kidding? Said Liz. Rarely in his life had Michael Harado felt more frustrated and fuzzled that he felt this evening as he once more trudged back to the hotel Gaila and Lawns. For the third time this day, he had been blocked in his efforts to plant the dynamite and detonator beside the grotto. Retiring slowly to the hotel, Jurado revived his forays and the failures and tried to make a sense out of them. Early in the afternoon, armed with his shopping bags of explosives, he had confidently undertaken his first effort of the day. He had wended his way down the crowded avenue Bernardis Subways to the corner, intent on following the stream of pilgrims crossing the street to the head of the ramp and going down the ramp into the domain. Stepping out of the crowd, he had stopped dead in his tracks, past the pedestrian traffic, across the way at the top of a ramp where the police and one of the white and a red squad car with a blue light on its roof. The police were strung out, barring access to the ramp and the domain, observing the visitors, apparently halting and questioning some. Jurado could not make out clearly what the police were up to, but they were there all right, exactly where he had seen them gathering last night. Realizing that he did not dare go closer considering the content of his shopping bag, he had backed off yet again and returned to the hotel. In his hotel room, he had taken a deck of a card from his suitcase and devoted himself to the endless game of solitaire. Tiring of his pasteboard thing, he had picked up a paperback novel by Kafka, flung himself on the bed, and read until he had dozed off. Awakened by the sound of a singing outside the window, the late afternoon procession, he has quantized at his bedside clock. 5:30 by now, he has hoped. the police would have done with whatever they were doing. He had washed his face and hands, retrieved the shopping bag, and for the second time this day has strolled over to Bellevardi della Grotto. Across the throughout fair, the hub of a scene has been a replica of what he had witnessed 4 hours or so before. There was a milling crowd, vocally annoyed by the slowdown while going into the domain, and the uniformed police apparently examined each worshippers and the tourists passing through a temporary barrier at the ramp entrance. Once more, Jurado knew that he dared not risk it until he was certain that the police had left. Returning to his hotel room, he had disposed of the shopping bag and feeling a paper of hunger. He had taken the lift down to the dining room from dinner. At the table for the eight, where a place was served for him, he has seen that his neighbor and a new friend, Natal Relinda, was already there eating, and that the chair next to her was unoccupied. He has taken his place, greeting Natila and the other guest. All French apologized for being late and ordered his dinner. The guest, along with Natla, had been deeply engaged in discussing some of the more dramatic cures that had occurred in the last 10 years at the grotto and the baths. Disinterested Jurado had not designed to be drawn into the conversation but consumed his meal moodily, his mind constantly intent on getting into the domain. Not until the dinner was over and the others were rising to leave and go to the nightly procession had Jurado attempted to speak to Natla. He had offered to escort her to her room, and she had thanked him and accepted. In the lift going to the second floor, Natla had asked him what he had done with himself this day. He had invited a lie about a hours of shopping to find a suitable gift for his mother in San Sebastian. Leaving the lift, he had inquired politely how she had spent her day. At the grotto, of course, she had told him. At the grotto, praying. And he had seen an opportunity of finding out about the span of a police there and inquired if she had run into any trouble getting to the grotto. She had told him that she would had no problem and wondered why he had asked. He had told her about the police at the ramp and the long delay in reaching the domain, and was curious about the sudden gathering of the grinders. At the door to her room, Natla had remembered that this had been briefly discussed at the beginning of the dinner by several of their dinner parties. Yes, there has been some police, and those who had discussed it assumed that the police had been trying to spot the veteran pickpockets and the prostitutes. While the table speculation have proved nothing, still Jurado felt it was something, and after seeing Natal into her room, bidding her good night and going back to his own quarters next door, and he had felt encouraged. Once in his room, he had decided to try again and felt that he would make it. Certainly by now, by the nightfall, the police would have found their petty criminals and dispersed so that the pilgrim traffic could resume at a normal pace. Preparing for a third advance on the domain, meaning to take the shopping bag with him. Jurado had hesitated about carrying it, had felt unaccountably cautious. He had decided that the would examine the terrain just to be sure that the path was clear, and once assured that it was clear, he would hasten back for his shopping bag and once more to go to Domain and the grotto and lose himself there and to do his preparatory job. For the third time, he had walked to the corner, and for the third time, the scene has not changed. He could see the delayed lines of the visitors pushing towards the ramp and the bulwarks of an uniformed Lutz policeman at the head of the ramp, dismayed but unencumbered by his explosives and feeling safer. Jurado had determined that this time he would have a closer look and see what this was all about. He had strolled into the street at to the cafe. Lee Royal found a seat and a table near the crowd, ordered a Coca-Cola and fixed his sight on the activity directly across the street. Pulling at the straw in his drink, he had finally been able to make out something of what was going on. The police, he could observe, were stopping only those pilgrims and the tourists with the baggages and the shopping bags, unwrapping the packages and searching the bags, then passing the people through to the ramp. Old Jurado had told himself, wait in the devil where they were looking for. One thing for the certain, he had been glad that he had not attempted to enter the domain with his own shopping bag. Now, still puzzled, he was returning to the hotel. Inside the entrance, calling for the key to 206 from the special key desk, taking it, going into the reception lobby, he became aware of the longy receptionist, the plump French lady known as Yoin, behind the desk, busy as ever with some kind of a ledger. The moment he saw her, he knew what to do. She would know what was going on. Most hotel persons, like once, knew everything, all the town news and the gossips, and she would tell him. Jurado deordered from the lift and strode to the reception desk with a cheerful smile. Hello, Yoni, he said to her. She raised her head from the ledger and smiled back. Good evening, Mr. Jurado. Why aren't you down at the procession? It was a perfect opening and he took it. Too hard to get down there. Police at every entrance was going on. Well, but she was Renault to answer. He summoned up his most flirtatious smile. Oh, come on, Yoni. You know everything. Not quite everything, but something. So you're not going to give a poor pilgrim a break. Well, it is confidential. If it could be strictly between us, you have my promises on the head of Virgin. Really, Mr. Jurado. In fact, in the return of an enlightenment, I promise to treat you to a drink this week. If I don't keep my word, I will owe you to drink even 3. She rose and leaned across the counter constably, and he cooperated by putting his head closer to her ears. Dropping her voice, she said, You won't break your words now. This is absolutely confidential. I have it from my closest girlfriend, Madeline. She is have a special relationship with the Inspector Fortune, who is the head of an Lutz Gramand. Yes, Yomi whispered. The police have had a tip that a terrorist may attempt to blow up the grotto of all the things this week. Jurado felt the clutch at his heart. He tried to keep his voice even. I don't believe it, he said. Nobody would do that. Certainly not this week. A tip, you say. It was an anonymous call. The inspector did not tell Madeline more. But he had stationed the gardeners at every entrance to the grotto, and they searched everyone going to the domain for explosives. They are taking it seriously, all right. In fact, she lowered her voice even more. They were now checking the foreigners in every hotel. I am not supposed to tell, but they are right here in the Gala and Lawrence this very minute. The inspector himself and a large contingent of police. They have keys to all the rooms. To open the rooms right now unoccupied and inspect what is it in them, and to examine the procession of the guests who are in their rooms. Jurado throat was dry. They were here now, the police. They started on the first floor about 15 minutes ago. They were working their way up. Corrado shook his head. I can't believe it. A police search in the Lutz in a week like this? Yanni shrugged. There's always could be some crazy one loose. Thanks for the gossip, Uni. I wove you wondering. About to turn away, someone occurred to him. He addressed Yanni once more. Casually, by the way, almost forgot to tell you. I have to be out of a town for a day or two. A friend's birthday. But hold my room. I will be back to use it. And oh yes, if the police want to know why 206 is unoccupied, you can assure them it is still occupied, okay? No problem. He pivoted towards the left and tried to appear unhurried, but in fact his legs were laden. The realization of what had probably happened struck him all at once. He had half forgotten Julia's telephone call from San Sebastian's yesterday morning. Her call confessing that she would tell their leader, Austin Lufus, what he was up to. He remembered defying Austin on the phone with Julia, and he remembered her warning him that if he hesitated on going ahead, Austin would try to stop him. He had insisted on going ahead, and that son of a bitch, Austin Lufus, had anonymously phoned the Lutz police and warned them of a possible terrorist act. Hurago knew that he must reach his room on the second floor before the police did. He must get rid of the explosives, real danger. He felt the warm moistures of an preservations of his brow. He waited for the lift. Corrado was inside his room, the door shut behind him. Falling against it to control his breath, he had poked his head out of the lift, casually praying that the police were not already there. If the police were there, he had made him his mind to get down the downstairs to get his car and make run for it. He might have a head start before they found the dynamite and the detonator in his room, and before they issued an all-point bulletins for his arrest. But when he had come out of the lift, it was empty and he was momentarily safe. Immediately, he made a dash for his room, unlocked the door, and threw himself inside. Now breathing hard, exhaling his gasp, he waited for his body to settle into some degree of normality. In these fleeting seconds, he tried to figure out his next move. The first thing to do was to get the explosives and his person out of the room, out of the hotel. But then what? Another hotel, a board house. Neither promised any more refuge. He would go for this rented car, drive out of the Lutz to some neighboring town, Pau maybe, and hole up there. He could safely commute to the Lutz, scout the domain, then vigil, determining that the anonymous call can be a crank call. The moment that the lawman let down their guards, he would slip with his explosives and do the job. Austin Lufus, he shouted in his head to his betrayed. I say you couldn't stop me, and you won't. But ahead of anything else, he had to put distance between himself and the hotel. Flinging himself away from the door, he lifted his suitcase, put it on the bed, and opened it. Then he went for the shopping, big a bag of dynamite, and by a man overreaching his sparse effort accords, and was able to make a room to fit into the explosives. He looked around the room to see if he had missed anything, and then remembered his toothbrush, toothpaste, and a shaving kit in the bathroom. He scooped them up, stuffed them into the suitcase, and shut it tight. Not another second to lose. Lifting the suitcase off the bed, Gripping it, he opened the door and glanced up and down the corridor empty. Time was still on his side. Revealed, he went out into the corridor, closed the door, and started swiftly towards the lift. Reaching the gate, hoping that the lift would be there, he saw that it was not there but in a use by somebody else. No choice then but to take the staircases next to it down the 2 floors to the lobby. As he moved to the head of the stairs, he heard the sounds, the tramping of the footstep ascending from below and a voice addressing someone, the voice spoken in the French. He eased himself to the side of the staircase and peered down into the stairwell. He had the briefest glimpse of a blue uniform one flight below. Trapped through he was. Jurado did not panic. He had escaped at least a half a dozen similar close calls in the Spain during his underground years. There was no time to think. There was only his survival instinct. If there was no exit and no place to hide his suitcase, there might still be one uncertain refuge. Hastily, he strode back towards his room, but stopped at the door just before his room, the room number 205. He could only hope that she was still inside where he had deposited her after dinner. He could only hope that she had not left to grope her way to the grotto alone once more. His knuckles rapped the wood door panel. No reply. About to try again, he thought that he heard some kind of movement behind the door. Most certainly, he could hear the heavy footsteps of in his left tramping up the stairs to the second floor corridors. And then he heard Natalie's voice on the other side. Who is it? He tried to keep his voice down. Yeah, about a whisper. Pressing against the doorbell, he said urgently, Natal, it's Michael. Michael Jurado. I need your help. Open the door. Almost instantly, as the French voices to his left filled the corridor, her door came away. Without another word, he slipped into her bedroom and shut the door. Locking it from the inside, he wheeled around and saw her standing a few feet from him, wearing no more than an diaphanous low-cut sleeveless white nightgown. No dark glasses this time, just her blank, unseeing eye fixed in his direction. Michael, she said, it is you. It's me. He sets his suitcase against the wall. You sounded so. You sounded like you were in trouble. Are you all right? He stepped close to her, gripped her bare arm. I am in a trouble, Natal. The local police have been altered that there is a terrorist loose. They are making a room by room search of the hotels. There are in this now one. They have just come to this floor, and if they find me a basque, they might take me for the suspect. Wrongly, but I could be in the trouble. I had to find some place to hide. If is there any place in these rooms I can hide? Michael, she said helplessly. I don't know what really in this room. What do you see? He had forgotten her blindness, and now he used his eyes. The room was 4 unwinging walls, the closest like the one he would have to swallow. Maybe the bathroom, he said, the shower. She was shaking her head. No, when they come, it is the first place they will look. Her face came alive. I know how you can hide. Do I say? Quickly, take off all your clothes. What? Michael, no matter. I can't see you. Undress fast. I have done the bed. Crawl into it. Get beneath the covers and pretend you are asleep. Put your clothes on the chair. I brought my suitcase under the bed. He grabbed the suitcase and shoved it out of the side. All the lights on? She asked. Yes, the chancellor. Turn it off. He turned off the overhead lights. There is still a dim lamp the other side of the bed. Leave it on. Are you undressing? I will. He yanked on his custody sports jacket. He unbuttoned his shirt and hung it on the nearest chair. Kicking off his shoes, he unbuckled his belt. Awkwardly, he stepped out of his trousers and dropped them on the chair. He stood naked except for his jock shirts and socks. All right, he said, I am undressed. Now get into the bed. Cover yourself. Close your eyes. Be asleep. He stepped to the bed. Had begun to get in too, when he saw her feelings her way along the foot of the bed and around it to the another side. She sat down on the side of the bed. I am getting into the bed with you. We were married. When the police knock, I will get up and answer. You will be asleep. Leave the rest to me. She was under the covers beside him, and he could sense her nearness and imagine her body. It would be erotic, exciting, but he was too tense and worried to allow his mind to be stimulated by it. I have an acute sense of hearing, she whispered. I am sure that they were very near. So pretend sleep and be very still, and I don't stir when they knock. Leave everything to Natal. I used to be an actress, you know. The suspense was full in this trot, almost gagging him, but he lay there unmoving, playing slumber and waiting for the knock on the door. Perhaps a minute or two had passed in the silence, and then it came. 3 sharp knocks on the door, 3 more knocks, a male voicing a French, anyone in the room? If so, open the door. Is that the police? Natal sat up in her bed. Yes, I'm here, she called out. I was asleep. Come, open the door. It is the gendarmes. We just want a few words with each of the guests. Nothing to worry about. I am coming, called out Natal, leaving the bed. 1 second. Jurado kept his eyes shut, drawing the blanket up his chin. He could hear Natla plodding around the bed to the door. He could hear the lock turning. He could hear the bedroom door creaking slowly until a thin shaft of a light from the corridor fell across the bottom of the bed. Through the slit of one eye, Jurado had a glimpse of an confirmation. He could see Natal in her transparent nightgown in the partially open doorway, and facing her, towering over her in the corridor, 2 police officers. The foremost of the officers, the older one, was speaking to Natal apologetically. I am Inspector Fountain of the Lutz, Commissioner the police, and I am sorry to disturb you like this, madam, but it is a necessity. We have received a warning that there is a terrorist loose in this city, probably armed, and we must treat it seriously. Now, with the assistance of our police colleagues from PAW and the Tarbis, we are making an overnight sweep of Lutz, searching every hotel Natalie had reached with fright. A terrorist, you say? Don't worry, madam. We have many on the search. There is nothing to fear. You are alone here, or any other in the room. Only my poor husband, so exhausted for a long planned trip to me in the Lutz that he is already fallen asleep. But of course, if you must, you can come in and wake him. Are there many of you to search my room? I can't tell. I can't. I am unable to. She had let her helpless voice drift off. In the bed, under the blanket, feigning sleep, Jurado steeled himself for what might happen next. But he suggested, without being able to look, the Natal had somehow indicated her condition. He listened. Apparently she had. For her, he heard a second and different male voice, higher pitched, probably to find the first policeman inspector. I believe the young woman is blind. Natalie was confirming this sadly. Yes, I am afraid I am. I have came to Lutz to seek help from the Virgin. Nevertheless, you can. The inspector's voice broke in. Never mind, madam, forgive us. He tried to be an jocular. I'm sure you are not a terrorist person, nor is my husband, Natalie said coolly. Neither of you? I'm certain, said the inspector. Sorry to have an awkward you. Just doing our duty. You can go back to the sleep now. Sorry to have disturbed you. We will be moving on to finish the rest of the floor. Good night, madam. Jurado heard them march off, opened his eyes as Natal shuts and locked the door. In the semi darkness, he watched her navigate around the bed once more and waited as she crawled around the blanket. How was that? She asked proudly. He rolled on his back, pushing the blanket off his chin. Bravo, you're wonderful, Natal, he added. I never attended a perfect performance. From her pillow, she was smiling. It was easy. I didn't need much acting. Others are always embarrassed and uneasy when they comfort someone who is blind. She paused. Are you? Embarrassed and uneasy? Of course not. No, not at all. I meant. Are you the only way they are after Michael? Are you some sort of terrorist? I'm not quite what the word implies, but the police might think so. What I'm really, you needed tell them, is a fighter for the freedom of my homeland, the Basque homeland presently in the Spain. His eyes held on her delicate, pale face, framed by the spread of her shiny raven hair on the pillow. Are you afraid of me? He asked. How can I be afraid of someone who saved me from an rapist? I was natural to wanted to protect you. I would never let anyone to hurt you. I'm in the same way, I would never let anyone hurt you. You are marvelous, Natal. He lifted himself on an elbow. I want to thank you once more. He leaned towards her to pick a kiss on her cheeks, but at the moment her head moved and the kiss found on her full, soft lips. Quickly he pulled away. Throwing his part of a blanket aside, he abruptly sat up. What are you doing, Michael? I would better get dressed up and leave you alone. I'll be on my way. Michael, she had reached out, fumbling for his bare arm, holding it. You can't. It is still too dangerous. Where would you go? I'm not sure yet, but I would better leave you. No, she said, gripping his arm more firmly. You needed not. You might be stopped in the corridor, in the lobby, in the town, and I won't have you risk it. You can stay here until morning and then see it if it is safe. If it isn't yet, you can stay with me until if it is safe. Jurado hesitated. Well, please, his hands have covered her. Well, maybe I could just sleep on the floor. Don't be foolish. You can stay right here in the bed with me. Briefly, Jurado was bewildered by her invitation and her frankness. It was not the way with the women he had known in his country. He said quietly, Are you sure you can trust me? She said simply, Are you sure I want to trust you? She removed her hands from his arm, took the fringe on the blanket and threw it off on her. She sat up and then, it what seemed a single gesture, lifted her nightgown, drew it over her head and luxurious hair and flung the nightgown aside. She faced in his direction. He sat speechless, unable to move. Michael, what it is? Does my blindness inhibit you? God, no, because it need not. In love, I don't have to see. Feeling is enough. Her arms were overstretched and he tore off his shorts, came to his knees, and fell into his arm, embracing her. His entire body was shaking and he pressured her to her. And was shivering, she said, Why? Because of the police. Because of you, it's you. He gasped, holding her tightly, feeling the hardness and conscious of his own growing hardness. Her mouth was at her ear. Don't worry about virginity, she whispered. I'm not exactly one. They were youthful episodes, but child's play. I have never made love with a man, a beautiful man. I'm not like anything. He tried to tell her in a strangled voice. Her fingertips was passing over his face. For me, you are the beautiful what I want. His hand guided her hair over his features, continued to guide her hand as her fingers touched his neck and the soft hair of his chest. When his hand realized her arm, her head continued downwards on its own. You are young and strong and wonderful, she whispered, her breath catching. Her warm fingers had found his heart one. Unworn fingers crawled around his body. You want me, she whispered breathlessly. I want you more than anything in this world. I want you. Love me, she whispered, sinking back on the bed and into the pillow, drawing him and slept asleep. Love me, darling Michael. Without cries on the sides and utter relief, holding and kissing and loving, each closer than they had ever been and another opposite human being. Long minute after, drained, lying on a bed separately but together, hands touching, exchanging the endowments, Michael realized that this Natal was silent. He looked closely and saw that she had fallen deeply asleep in her own special darkness, asleep with a smile on her lips. Smiling down at her tenderly, he drew the blankets up over her shoulders. At last they lay back to be with himself. He had not known such a period of peace in the years. He marveled at the absence of his anger. There was a left in him, pervading his entire being merely the residue of a love he had felt for his young women. Gradually, in his drowsiness, he sought the purpose of being in this bed in this town of Lodz. Reality, the larger reality, slowly surfaced. It was not easily to supremize reality on, even obliterate briefly the love that he felt. It was difficult to bring harsh hatred and his season for being here back to his consciousness, but images of his Basque childhoods and adolescence, his father's murder, the masters of his slavery, evoked anger and hatred one more. With regrets, he considered that the child woman he adored is slumber beside him. What he was feeling contradicted all that he felt for her. She did this dear one was a person of an unblemished faith in a fairy stories that she fervently believed could restore her to normality and living. He, by necessity, reminded an enemy of that faith that was now misleading his people in compliance with an inevitable treachery and certain continuous enslavements. To free his people, he must destroy the symbol of a faith that might lead to their deception and endless tantrums. But his act of an distraction, he would also destroy forever Natalie, foolish hope, and her love. But he saw it must be done. He owned himself and the loss he must endure to an even greater love. Oh, Natalie, Natalie, when it is over, I have succeeded. Tried to understand, but he knew she would never understand. At the same time, it suddenly occurred to him, considering that he had been forced into hiding, that he might never succeed. The police were everywhere and might continue to be everywhere until the 8 days has ended. How could he blow up the grotto if he did not have the means of bringing the explosives into the domain? Then an idea, an inspiration came, a means, something he could do tomorrow. If it worked, he might succeed and turn away the Virgin Mary forever. Wednesday, August 17th. After 10 minutes to 9 in the morning, Michel of the Centuries Press Bureau was briskly leading the way across the rosary of the domain to the medical bureau. Following her were the town's latest arrival, Dr. Paul Kalsberg, and his dependable nurses, Esther Livingston. It was Keilsberg's first real view of any portions of the Lutz in the daylight. Despite the sight of much religion's strategy, the number of an invalid in the wheelchairs and the stretchers, and his misgivings about the shrine. He had to admit that the parade ground, or whatever it was supposed to be, offered up an aura of pastoral peace and sanitary on its sunny summer days. Dr. Kleinberg on his nurse had caught the last air interflight from the Paris late yesterday, and when they had left the plane at the Lutz airport, it has already been nightfall. The press lady with her car had been waiting. During the short drive to their accommodation, Keilsberg, who had become straight from his Paris office to Orly airport to this Pyrrhus village, had been too excited to bother to glance out the car window as they have passed through the Lutz. As the Hotel Aristora in the Grotto, ordinary single rooms has been reserved for them. After telephoning his wife, Alice, in Newly, to tell her and the boys that he had arrived safely and to let her have the numbers where he might be reached, he had gone straight to the bed and slept without a break for 9 hours. Now, as he walks, Keilsberg noticed how rigid and aloof his nurse was. Knowing her, the orphanaged daughter of German parents, gassed and cremated in the Nazi Holocaust, he knew how uncomfortable she was with, comforted by an sort of an fatalism, politicians or religious. Neilingberg felt no dissimilar discomfort in these surroundings. His parents had moved from Venice to Paris long before the rise of the Hitler and had become naturalized French citizens. He himself had been born a Frenchman, and despite a prestigious degree of muted anti-Semitism among a minority in the France, Keilsberg felt that he belongs and was a part of this land. His knowledge of an French culture was broad, although his acquaintance with the Bernardis and the apparization and the Grotto from time to time in the newspaper and the magazine, and also had read with a mild interest about the occasional cures attributed to Lourdes. Besides such casual readings, Keilsberg's only knowledge of the holy town had come from his careful perusal of 3 books involved Dr. Alice Carroll's. One of the books was about Carroll's, 2 written by him, each going into an great physician, one visit to the Lourdes in 1903. Keilsberg had acquired and read the Carl books after he had been invited to join the International Medical Community of the Lourdes, which was assembling in the Paris to review and ascertain the so-called miraculous cure of an English woman, Mrs. Eatmore, suffering from an sarcoma. Keilsberg has been unable to assist the committee because of an previously scheduled medical meeting in London. But upon his return to the Paris, the Lourdes people have contacted him again. The members of the international medical community had been favorably disposed towards granting Mrs. Moore case's miraculous status, but had withheld the final approval until they could have the vote of an specialist in sarcoma. Keilsberg was one of the 2 foremost specialists in the France treating an malignant growths. The other, Dr. Morin Dowell, whom Keilsberg knew and respected, had been too involved in experimental researches to cooperate. So there was only Keilsberg in the bring in as an final consultant, and he had been reluctant to become involved in anything of an religious nature, yet yearning that the Dr. Alex Carroll had once visited and investigated Lutz, Cailbert had given the matters some second thought. As a student at the Cochin School of Medicine attached to the University of Paris, Cailsberg had admired the writings and the career of Dr. Carroll. Cailsberg recalled that the scientist had kept an open mind about the Lutz and spent some time there. Cailsberg reread Dr. Carroll's and verified his students' recollections. The great Carroll had indeed treated Lutz seriously, so the Paul Cailsberg had agreed to accept the invitations of the International Committee and go to the Lutz to review the incredible cure of the woman named Edsbor. Here we are. He heard a Madeline and a bend. Where were they? Cailsberg stopped and looked about the Oriental himself. They were on a sidewalk on the opposite side of a rosary. They were at the double doors of the entrance to a building made up of an rugged, large stone block. Above the entry, white lettering on a blue sign, were the words Medical Bureau Secretariat. Let me take you inside, the press lady was saying. I will introduce you to the bureau head, Dr. Breyer, then leave you within him. Cailsberg and Esther followed the mandolines inside and found themselves in a spacious afternoon. With the two offices' doors on the right, the press lady gestured off to the second door. Let me tell you, Dr. Brainey's secretary, you are arrived. After the press lady has disappeared into the office, Cailsberg and the Esther took their bearings. The wall of an anteroom was decorated with what resembled the antiquaft of an medical museum. After a quick glance, Esther avoided a closer look at the artifact and immediately occupied the corner of a sofa, sitting tight-lipped, eyes on the floor. But Cailsberg was more interested. He began to go to the ground afternoon, studying the displays. Thank you.